Good morning, Dog Nation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. And obviously, huge news in the college football world yesterday, the retirement of Nick Saban. We were on video last night reacting to this in the immediate moments that we were learning about it. And now, with more time to think about it, we'll have additional thoughts specifically on how this impacts Georgia, the way the fans are reacting to it, and kind of what it means for Georgia here moving forward. That's the focus of our discussion here today. One quick programming note. Normally it's Terrence Edwards on a Thursday. Terrence is predisposed today on assignment, if you want to say it that way. He's got some stuff going on. So Mike Griffith, who we only had for a short period of the time yesterday because we had to edit out some of the Jade Mayev stuff, will be with us today, and Mike will give us some additional thoughts on kind of how all of this is about to play out with Alabama looking for a head football coach for the first time since 2007. So a lot to get to. The Saban retirement is obviously reverberating through the annals of all of sports, so we'll cover it here for you right now. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com. This is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
By now you know Nick Saban is retiring. That's huge news, and Georgia fans have a lot of takes and opinions on it. We're going to share some of ours here there as well. And obviously, when you've had the kind of, fight for supremacy that Georgia and Alabama have been having the last few years, you're going to have a little bit of back and forth stuff with the fan bases. I enjoy doing that. I will do some of that on the show today, no doubt. Bama fans will give it back in kind, and that's just sort of the way that it goes with, college football, especially in the SEC. I love, taking my little pot shots at Bama from time to time. I enjoy sharing those things with you, and I think Bama fans enjoy coming right back on it. And yet there's also sort of a bigger picture perspective that Nick Saban's retirement does, I believe, to a certain degree, transcend some of the basic back and forth stuff that goes on among fans. I don't mind telling you that I find Nick Saban to be pretty inspiring, and I don't have any, dispute whatsoever with anyone who says that Nick Saban's the best college football coach of all time. I believe you could take it a step further to say Nick Saban, I think, may be the best coach, period, in any sport ever in terms of the impact he had on the sport that he's been a part of. I think that's how good Nick Saban has been. He's certainly been a formidable foe for Georgia throughout the years. And, I used the word inspiring a moment ago. To me, if you'll allow me to say this just for a second, I think sometimes our society, we make superheroes out of really successful people in a way that I don't believe is helpful for society overall. In other words, think about like the tech moguls, whichever your favorite tech mogul kind of is. We sort of treat those people as if they have some sort of superhuman intelligence that makes them different than regular people. And, they have sort of an ability that we couldn't even aspire to. And so therefore we sort of treat them as they're like separate from us, superhero type people. We do that as well with celebrities, whether it be athletes or sometimes, movie stars, something like that, that somehow they've hit some sort of genetic lottery. And so therefore they're apart from us. They're separate from us. They're like superheroes. Those of us who are just mere mortals can't even imagine what it must be like to have, that level of talent or ability or whatever else. We do that with famous, successful people sometimes. But when a guy like Nick Saban comes along, I think that Saban reminds us of something pretty important, that a good bit of success in almost any field is just based on your level of determination. A good bit of success in any field is just sort of based in your level of commitment, that almost anyone could be Nick Saban. He's got some intelligence and probably had some luck along the way and some things like that. But ultimately, Saban's true success was based on his willingness to commit to that success and his determination to see that through all the way to the end. This is something that he's talked about plenty. And I do think that's somewhat inspiring. And so while I love kind of treating Saban as a rival or an enemy or a nemesis, whatever else, the truth is while Saban's been having the success that he's had over the course of his career and good enough at times to sort of share thoughts on the success formula overall, I've sort of found that to be, somewhat inspiring. I think that Saban's story. Now, listen, the results are not going to be replicable for everybody in every situation, but the so-called Saban process that he made famous, that's the kind of thing that anyone could try to copy. In fact, plenty of college football programs have tried to copy it, not to the same level of success, but the actual formula itself, the actual blueprint, the actual process is on full display for everyone to see. And it's not some magic trick. It's not some genetic lottery. It's not some superhuman level of intelligence. It's just sort of a regular guy from West Virginia who was fully committed to the idea of being the very best he possibly could be. And I think we all take something kind of positive from that, even those of us who would say that, over the course of years we've, found Saban a little distasteful. You certainly are inspired by the success that he's had. Now, that said, I think it's been really interesting to watch Georgia fans and their reaction to the Saban news over the last, not quite 24 hours as of yet when we're recording this, but just over the course of the last few hours. There seems to be a level of celebration going on in some pockets of Georgia fandom on this, some pockets of Dog Nation. Perhaps not quite as out there as like the Auburn fans who are rolling Toomer's Corner and some of that silly stuff, but there has been some celebration from some Georgia fans. And to one degree, I sort of get that, but to another degree, I would sort of say this, is that I don't think Georgia needs Nick Saban's retirement for this program to be as good as it possibly can be. In fact, Nick Saban was fully employed as the Alabama head football coach in 2021 and 2022. And as you know, Georgia won national championships in both of those years. So Saban's retirement, I don't believe, necessarily unlocks some new level of achievement for Georgia. They were doing just fine as a program, even when Saban is employed. Now, could there perhaps be more winning along the way? Of course, there probably could. But, Georgia's not one of those programs, the way that maybe Auburn would be, that needs Saban to go away so Georgia can have success. Georgia has had plenty of success, even in the last couple of years, even with Nick Saban there. If you're a Georgia fan and you want to celebrate something here today, this is what I think you celebrate. Is that your coach is not 70-whatever years old, and your coach is not at the end of his career. Your coach is very much at the beginning of his career. He's only 8 years into it here. Very, very young man. Very, very energetic. Of course, I'm talking about Kirby Smart. And the idea that Kirby Smart can now have potentially, if he wants it, decades more success here at UGA and still be a long way away from anywhere near being what could be the end of his career if that's what he chooses to be. If you're a Georgia fan, that's the thing I think today you ought to want to celebrate here. Not the fact that, Saban's gone, so therefore we can be good. Georgia was already good. In fact, Georgia's been great. Saban is gone, but Kirby Smart's not going anywhere for a very long time. If you're a Georgia fan today, that is what I think you celebrate. Now, speaking of Smart and Kirby, a lot of folks have kind of pointed this out. There was a pretty poignant moment before the SEC championship game back in Atlanta in December where these two guys, obviously knowing each other very well, Kirby, I think, probably ended up working for Saban about as long as any assistant coach has. And they shared kind of an emotional moment there where Saban kind of revealed to Kirby, that he feels like he's getting a little too old, and Kirby had some very nice things to say. In fact, let me let you see and hear this as it's been shared by the SEC Network on social media here. Kind of a, I would say, pretty heartfelt exchange between Kirby Smart and Nick Saban prior to the SEC championship. Take a look at this.
But you're right about one thing. I'm too old for this. No, you ain't. Y'all did a great job this year. Nobody's done as good a job as you have. This long, this to me, this good. Try to enjoy it, man. Hell of a coach. Appreciate all you did for me.
Hard not to be moved by that. Listen, I think that's genuine. I mean, these are coaches that are where the camera's on them, and sometimes you perform in front of the camera the way that you think you're supposed to, but these are two guys that kind of know what the cost is. They count the cost in their own way, in their own jobs. They know what it takes. Kirby to see Saban do it as long as he has. Saban to see Kirby have success as quickly as he has. They know what it takes. They share that moment there, and I would say that's, pretty moving overall. Now, it also leads into another win for Saban against Kirby and what turns out to be the final matchup between the two, and I do get that. And I guess to kind of wrap up this portion of our discussion, I want to say this way. I mentioned a moment ago, if you're a Georgia fan, you don't need to be celebrating Nick Saban's retirement because of what it does for you. Georgia was already great, but the Alabama fan I know is going to pop in here and say, but he only ever beat Kirby Smart. Kirby Smart only ever beat Nick Saban the one time. He only did that the one time. And that's one of those things that Alabama fans on this particular day, the retirement of Saban and the new era for that program, they're going to try to hold that over on a Georgia fan. And here's what I'm here to tell you. In the kind of fun, good-natured, back-and-forth stuff that goes on between fan bases, if you're a Georgia fan, I think you need to understand the context of that argument and sort of see it for what it is and see it for what it isn't. The Alabama fan is going to say the one win for Kirby against Saban and the larger number of wins that Saban had against Kirby, that's like the ultimate checkmate in this discussion. But I'm here to tell you right now, that is simply not the case. That in actuality, and this is the thing that Georgia fans ought to remember, and this is the thing that Georgia fans ought to give back when you're having these good-natured discussions back and forth with the Alabama fans. The real issue about, Kirby Smart only beating Nick Saban one time, I would say, is really more about the small number of times they've actually coached against each other, more so than anything else. This year in September was supposed to be the very first ever real regular season matchup in a non-pandemic year between Kirby Smart and Nick Saban. We've never had one of those in the Kirby Smart era. This was supposed to be it this year. Nick Saban's not going to be there. So would Kirby Smart have had more chances to beat Nick Saban if they coached more in the regular season? I would certainly say there's a chance that's true because Kirby Smart's had a habit of winning more of his regular season games in recent years than Nick Saban has. Plus, when you look at a couple of times in which Georgia has lost to Alabama in the SEC championship, what is sort of obscured by that is the number of times in the Kirby Smart era that Georgia has won the SEC championship game when Nick Saban and Alabama were nowhere to be found, like 2017, like 2022. These were years in which Georgia was good enough to win the SEC championship, but Alabama wasn't good enough to win its own division to be there for that game. That's more opportunities for a Georgia win against Alabama, but Alabama didn't qualify to play, in the game there at that particular time. And when you go back to, the heartbreak of the 2017 national championship game, the heartbreak of the 2018 SEC championship game, these are truly, tough losses if you're a Georgia fan to take. But it's also important to remember coming into those seasons just how much larger the stature was of Alabama compared to Georgia. The fact that Georgia came so close to winning only to come up a little bit short at the end, I think does not speak to the bulletproof nature of the Alabama program. It speaks to how quickly Kirby Smart was building up Georgia overall. The fact that in his second year as a football coach, in his second year at Georgia, he already essentially had Georgia playing on equal footing to Alabama tells you how quickly things were happening in Georgia, not how long they were having to wait. And the idea that finally in the 2021 national championship game, Georgia overtook Alabama, won that, and won the next two national championships sort of speaks to the amazing pace with which Kirby Smart has built this Georgia program to something that has stood on equal footing compared to Alabama. And yeah, I know they'll say, but what about this December? What about the Alabama win? Here's the thing. If the only thing that they, meaning Alabama fans, have over you is the idea that a 29-game winning streak, the longest ever in the SEC, came to an end, if that's all they have over you, you couldn't win 30 games in a row. If that's what they've been kind of backed into a corner on in terms of their argument against you, that tells me everything I need to know, that Georgia's doing plenty of winning, and the argument they're trying to make isn't as much of a winner as they think that it probably is. So bottom line in all of this, the Nick Saban era has come to an end. It's inspiring because of how great he was, and yet everything that is great eventually comes to an end. But the reign of Kirby Smart is not ending anytime soon. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. We're happy to have you with us. 9:45, we're live, 1st and 15, DawgNation.com, DawgNation app. We take your comments there. Normally, we're live at 10 a.m. For now, as you know, we're kind of doing some pre-record stuff to make the show run a little bit more smoothly, so we appreciate your patience on that, but obviously we're recording it here the morning of, and we'll be back live again before the show is done for our R.S. Andrews cool down at the end of the day here today. Radio, of course, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref. Podcast, you know that. All the platforms there. Thank you so much for your continued support of our podcast. Boy, we really appreciate all of that. And a huge thanks to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp who make today's show possible. Your source for Georgia divorce. And, it's one of those things where Merriweather and Tharp has been serving folks in the Atlanta area and serving them well for such a long time. There is now a demand across the entire state to get that same level of service, whether in Savannah or coming soon in Athens. When you're outside the Atlanta area, you want the same level of care during a divorce process that Merriweather and Tharp provides. And that's why we've said for a while, your source for Georgia divorce, But now the new website reflects that, GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. You can go there. You can find out all the free resources that Meriwether and Tharp has had for a long time. Blog posts, podcasts, things like that, to educate you about the divorce process. Now, when I say the word divorce, I don't say it lightly because I know what a weighty subject that is. One of the most, I guess, nerve-wracking and stress-inducing things you may ever have to go through. In fact, wisely, you've probably tried to avoid that or put that off for as long as you possibly can. Try to find some way to salvage the relationship that you're in. And yet sometimes reality has to be confronted that the next step is divorce. And while I can't take the pain of that away from you, I can give you an advocate to walk on your side through this process. And our friends at Meriwether and Tharp are that. Now, when you go to their website, GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com, one of the things you're going to see is an array of options for you as a way of getting some cost certainty and how the divorce process is going to work for you, because different divorces require different things. Some things are really simple and straightforward, and for you, a DIY option might be there where you can kind of mostly handle this yourself for a very small fee, and Meriwether and Tharp can help you out with that. Other people kind of want a little bit more hands-on relationship with their divorce attorney, and Meriwether and Tharp offers you a couple of models there on that, including the M&T assisted model, which, as I said before, with the idea of cost certainty in mind, they give you a couple of different options for how you might pay for that. There's a subscription service. You can kind of pay monthly as your divorce process is ongoing, or if you want something that's a little bit more of a flat fee, they can offer that for you there as well, including some of the great services they can provide for you as you make sense of this divorce process. So please, find them online. It's GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. Meriwether and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. All right, we are going to get today, in place of Terrence Edwards, normally joining us on Thursday. Terrence not able to be with us here today. We are going to get Mike Griffith back on the show today. We were short with Mike yesterday because some of the stuff we had pre-recorded with Mike was related to Jade Maeva, and obviously that story has kind of changed a lot, so we took that out of the show. We'll have more of Mike today, kind of getting big picture into how all of this is going to play out with Nick Saban, kind of what's next for Alabama, how this impacts Georgia. We'll do a lot of that with Mike here coming up in a moment. Prior to that, around the doghouse, similar type of thing. And I think the immediate part of the impact on Georgia here, it's probably fair to ask what this means for Georgia co-defensive coordinator Glenn Schumann. Schumann is an Alabama graduate. Schumann is someone who was working as a kind of entry-level staffer at Alabama prior to Kirby Smart taking the Georgia job in 2016. I think that Schumann is a rising star in the coaching ranks. He's obviously been a tireless recruiter. Georgia's inside linebacking recruiting, that's the position that Schumann's responsible for, has been as recruited as well as any position has across any program in all of college football. And he's obviously a sharp defensive mind as well. So perhaps on a couple of fronts, Schumann could be of interest to Alabama, and perhaps, Schumann's alma mater is of some interest to him. To give you some extra context on this, let's go back to SEC Media Days here this past summer. Kirby Smart speaking about Schumann, the story of how he got to be at Georgia, and the value he brings to the Georgia program. This is Kirby on Schumann from July.
First off, Glenn Schumann's an incredible man and person. He's a graduate of Alabama. He came there on the Bear Bryant scholarship. His dad played football at Alabama. He's the son of a football coach. He's extremely bright. He's extremely passionate. I rely heavily on Glenn for input on practice schedules, defensive design, thinking outside the box. There's not a time that when I think of who can I ask on my staff that understands what we want and what we need, Glenn Schumann's that guy. He's very talented. And Glenn Schumann will be the first to admit he came to the University of Georgia without ever getting an on-the-field coaching position, and I was very confident in his role to do that. What has he done with that? He has produced one of the most productive inside linebacker rooms in the country, and he's one of the people that really believes in growth being a part of his process, and he continues to grow to this day.
So let me give you two things in that Kirby clip, because I do believe that Kirby clip gives you some interesting context on kind of how, Schumann perhaps plays into all of this. A, he is an Alabama graduate, and so therefore there might be that gravitational pull back to the alma mater. We were saying this a little bit the other day when Kevin Steele announced his retirement as a precursor to now Nick Saban announcing his retirement. So perhaps for Schumann, the idea of being a little bit of an emotional connection to your alma mater would certainly make sense. That might be true. But the flip side of that is Kirby Smart says while he was at Alabama, kind of a Bear Bryant scholarship recipient, the truth is it was also Georgia that gave him his first on-field coaching job, and Kirby Smart who gave him his first on-field coaching job. So therefore, there might be some additional loyalty to UGA because of the way in which he's grown as a coach while being at Georgia. But the other part of that Kirby mentions is, when he's asked a question about Glenn Schumann, goes into that kind of detail, saying, I'm paraphrasing here, but, he's so integral to our process. He's such a great, value to us. Clearly there's that need to kind of boost Schumann up because what the caricature that could pretty easily be drawn is of, Schumann's just a guy who's an understudy. This is really Kirby Smart's defense, the same way at one point in time people would have said that about Kirby working under Nick Saban. This is really Kirby Smart's defense. Schumann may be a good young coach, good recruiter, but this is Kirby Smart's defense, and Will Muschamp's there. This may be Will Muschamp's defense. In other words, the young coach, how responsible is he really for the success that Georgia's having? It almost kind of reminds me a little bit of, if you follow the NFL, this past year we saw Eric Bieniemy, who had been offensive coordinator with the Kansas City Chiefs, go to Washington trying to get away from Andy Reid because the thought was, as long as Andy Reid's the head coach working with Patrick Mahomes, we're not really quite so sure how much respect and success Eric Bieniemy should receive and how much of that success he's really responsible for, given the fact that Andy Reid is thought to be this great offensive mind, and any offensive success is probably actually a result of Andy Reid more so than Eric Bieniemy. So Bieniemy was saying, I got to get away from Andy Reid so I can go make a name for myself as a coach. Does perhaps Glenn Schumann think the same way? If he did, he wouldn't be the first coach to think that. But we don't have any evidence right now that's necessarily the case. In fact, the evidence we do have would suggest what Kirby Smart said in that clip is true, that Schumann, because this is the spot where he got his first on-field coaching job and because of the close relationship that he has with Kirby Smart, seems that Schumann is happy here and content to stay here, perhaps. I will also say that in terms of the early chatter about who could be the replacement as head coach at Alabama, we've seen Schumann show up on something like the gambling odds and on some of the lists that some of the national reporters are putting out. But thus far, it's been mostly guys with like current head coaching experience or previous head coaching experience who seem to be being talked about the most there. So we think that Schumann is a rising star in the coaching ranks, much the same way that Dan Lanning, the previous Georgia defensive coordinator, would have been in the past. But in terms of being ready in the eyes of the hiring staff there at Alabama, Greg Byrne and others, to kind of step into the role as Alabama head coach here right now, the early chatter would suggest maybe not. That's not quite the case for Schumann, but obviously if you're looking for an immediate impact on Georgia from the Saban news, keeping your eye on Glenn Schumann would seem to make some sense, and hoping to hold on to Glenn Schumann at Georgia is clearly something the Dogs want to do. We'll make that around the doghouse here for you today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. Now, before our show is done today, we're going to get more into detail about who truly might be candidates for the Alabama job, the impact this has on the Alabama players, and perhaps Georgia's interest in some of them. We'll talk about that. We'll also celebrate a big win last night for Georgia basketball. This is by far and away, I would say, the best Georgia basketball team in the DawgNation Daily era. So we'll have some fun with that before we're done. But for now, on more of the kind of subject matter and the talking points here related to Nick Saban, specifically its impact on Georgia, let's do all of that right now. Special guest on a Thursday, Mike Griffith here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
And here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp, we'll talk to Mike Griffith here in the aftermath of the Nick Saban news. We did some of this on video last night. We'll re-rack it here, though, for a little bit of a different audience. Mike, I want to talk about, kind of what this means for college football overall, what this means for Georgia. Let me do the Georgia part of this for a moment. We'll kind of broaden it out before we're done. I think the most immediate way in which this could impact Georgia is somehow Glenn Schumann, the Alabama graduate, co-defensive coordinator at UGA, somehow gets caught up in this news cycle. Early days here, we haven't heard too much of that yet. How much do you think that Schumann could be involved either as a possible candidate to become head coach at Alabama or perhaps a very pricey new defensive coordinator to pair with whoever Alabama does hire at head coach, kind of going back home to his alma mater and perhaps getting a chance to sort of chart his own path? Do you think there's any chance the Schumann stuff shows up in this story at all?
Well, I mean, there's always a chance, and Schumann is a well-respected young coach, and young coaches like new challenges. But at the same time, Brandon, I mean, this is Georgia's in a better position than Alabama. Georgia had the number one recruiting class. Georgia's the preseason number one. Glenn's got a young family here, and he's had opportunities to leave, and he's a young guy, and I don't know that the Alabama position right now, following Saban, I mean, the old saying, you don't want to be the next guy, you want to be the next guy that follows the next guy. Now, I wonder if a guy like Dan Lanning gets the job, if Schumann might be a candidate, but wouldn't he bring his Oregon staff with him? I think he probably would, and Tosh Lupoi is a guy that has been at Alabama before, so I don't think it affects Georgia in a negative way in the least. And the most positive way is, maybe the SEC schedule makers will finally see fit to let Alabama play at Georgia, because clearly it wasn't going to happen as long as Saban was there. Georgia's got to play there again this year, Brandon, and they just played there in 2020. I'm still trying to unpack why it wasn't Alabama's turn to come to Athens. So I don't think so. I don't think I could be wrong. I mean, maybe Glenn Schumann just wants to get out from Kirby Smart, but I don't sense that from this staff. I sense a lot of harmony. I see Schumann out front, even as Will Muschamp works with him. I see a really talented Georgia team that Glenn has helped build. So I don't think so.
One of the things you and I talked about on video a little bit last night was, at one point in time, if Saban retired, the obvious name was Dabo Swinney, Alabama grad. He'd won 2 national championships. It was just the easiest thing for anyone to sort of slot in to this discussion. But, time changes things, and time has passed since that was kind of an obvious point to make. And I think we now exist in a world, and I'm not trying to be snarky, I'm not trying to be, trollish. I don't think that Dabo Swinney is of a level as a coach to get this job. Clemson has not been in the playoffs since 2020, coaching in a much easier league. The idea of a 2018 national championship for Clemson, Dabo Swinney second, that seems like an entirely different universe from where college football is right now. I mean, at one point in time, I think Alabama sort of thought of itself as the kind of program that could flex and take this championship coach away from Clemson. At this stage, Mike, I have to sort of assume that Alabama no longer wants him.
Well, I mean, that's a broad statement. There's, I don't know who Alabama is, right? I think there's parts of Alabama that do want him. The question is who's making the call. Is the money making the call? Is Paul Bryant Jr. involved? Is this a Greg Byrne hire? And as we tape this, I think they probably already have a pretty good idea. Jimmy Sexton is a really powerful guy that controls a lot of these sorts of things and directs a lot of his clients. What Dabo did at Clemson was beat everybody with the new football building and a family atmosphere, and Georgia followed closely behind with their new building and even more connectedness and better recruiting and a better staff. And then Michigan took it up another level, and they had the best program in the country. So, the game continues to change, and I'm not going to say that Dabo couldn't change with the game. I would tell you that the resources in Clemson don't match Georgia's. They don't match Alabama's. I think Dabo could win it at Alabama. That said, I would agree with you that that his brand isn't what it was after winning 2 national titles. That's for certain. As far as who measures up to the Alabama job, some of the guys that don't want to leave their program. That Kirby Smart does, but he doesn't want to leave Georgia. Mm-hmm. Some people would say Steve Sarkisian, but Texas is probably a better job than Alabama right now, particularly when you consider the resources and the unrealistic expectations that whoever takes that job will have cast upon them. So I think your point's well made on Dabo. I wonder, if he'll even get an interview, because I think this process is really far along, Brandon. I don't think this is a surprise to the powers that be in Tuscaloosa.
Saban's been coach at Alabama now for quite some time. There's a lot of folks in our audience that are young enough. They perhaps don't have much of a memory of Alabama pre-Nick Saban, but that kind of period of time after Gene Stallings, the early 90s, before Saban got the job, and there were a lot of fits and starts for Alabama, and a lot of years in which Alabama was losing 6 and 7 games, and some years even, more than that. I think I have a hard time processing exactly what the Alabama program is going to be with Nick Saban no longer as head coach. It's clearly one of the biggest name brands in college football, no matter who's at the helm. But a lot of the success that Alabama has had, I have to assume, was kind of particular to Saban because Alabama wasn't really having a ton of that before Saban got here. Long story short, how good do you think the Alabama program still is with someone other than Nick Saban leading it?
Well, that's really interesting. I guess the closest comparison is Steve Spurrier, the way he dominated the 1990s at Florida. He was every bit as dominant at the SEC level. I think Coach Spurrier won 6 or 7 SEC titles in 12 years, and wasn't, what was he, 5 or 6 years removed from his last title in 2001 when he left. I think Saban's 3 years removed. That's the interesting thing to me when we talk about this is that he didn't really go out on top. No, not really. They haven't won a title in 3 years. Georgia has won the last 2 titles representing the SEC. Saban's was on the way down. The dynasty was over. But to your point, it's hard to see. Florida. We all thought somebody would take over at Florida. Gosh, Brandon, how many people can even tell you who the next head coach was after Steve Spurrier? Right? Everybody said that Tennessee could win. That without Philip Fulmer, that anybody could win an SEC title. They had the facilities and all the talent, and Lane Kiffin came in there and in 1 year dropped a nuclear bomb on it with NCAA issues and issues off the field that people still talk about. So it's not automatic that a program carries on if that's what you're getting at. I think there's something to be said for that. Now, I will say this again. I think this has been a process. And I think this has been coming, and I think Greg Byrne had both eyes wide open. I think there's a plan in place. I think Dan Lanning is the best young coach in the country, the best investment anybody could make. I don't know if Dan wants to step into that and leave Oregon. Maybe, maybe not. Hard to say. If they get Dan Lanning, I think that's scary. I think it's scary because I'm going to tell you, Brandon, I think Dan Lanning has more energy and more ability to handle today's game than Nick Saban did. That's the scary hire for Georgia. Yeah,
I'm going to go into more detail on this later on in the show, but as a Georgia fan, Lanning is the coach that I would at least want Alabama to hire. That's the guy that causes me the most trouble as a Georgia partisan is probably Lanning. Not to say that a Sarkisian or a Kiffin or someone like that, if he would be the guy, couldn't be successful. But Lanning, to me, is the most turnkey of all the options. I think he's already built Oregon into a big-time program. I believe that Oregon may be the best program in the Big Ten here over the course of the next couple of years. I think that Lanning is one of the real rising stars and perhaps maybe the story of this past season because, I know Kalen DeBoer is the guy that, got to the national title game, but in terms of long-term staying power, I'm not quite so sure that Lanning didn't put more of that on display. So as someone who wants Georgia to be the best it can be and doesn't want Alabama kind of getting in the way of that, I don't want Dan Lanning at Alabama. I will say that would be a more problematic hire for me than guys like Kiffin or Sarkisian, whose success I would say was probably less certain.
I totally agree, and the energy level and the knowledge that Dan has, and listen, Dan has eaten off the floor. And this is where I kind of quell the Glenn Schumann, speculation. Glenn hasn't eaten off the floor. He's eaten at Alabama and he's eaten at Georgia. But Dan Lanning is a guy that was starving for a job before. And at some point, Glenn Schumann's going to get the opportunity to prove himself, and I think he'll be a fantastic coach. But Dan Lanning is a much more proven commodity. He's much more battle-tested, especially now that he's been a head coach out there at Oregon, where he took over a culture that was, quite frankly, somewhat soft. And he made the Ducks pretty hard. He took over a quarterback that was kind of broken in Bo Nix, and he fixed him up pretty good. Bo looked pretty good this season, I thought. So I'm with you, Brandon. We're in complete agreement. Dan Lanning is the one guy, the name that Georgia fans do not, any fans, college football fans. I'm gonna make an analogy here, and I'll probably lose half the audience when I do this, but I won't lose you. It's kind of like when Dale Earnhardt came out of the number 3 car. Kevin Harvick was a pretty good guy to put in that car behind him. Mm-hmm. It doesn't always happen that the next guy that takes the wheel of that fast car can drive it the same way.
Yeah.
But Dan Lanning is a guy that if you put him behind the wheel of that Alabama car, he's going to drive it deep into the turns, and he's going to go door to door with anybody.
I think that's a pretty good analogy. Let me finish with this, and this is total speculation, but I am curious of your opinion. There are people who are going to want to make the Saban retirement about oh, it's a rebuke of the new system that's in place in college football, whatever you define as the new part of all of this. I think Deion Sanders has even sort of made some sort of allusion to that. How much of this would you presume is about Saban being 70-plus years old and it's just sort of time and he wants to enjoy good health in retirement years? And how much of this is, I don't want to be a part of this sport with all of these changes? People are going to want to make it about that. At least some people are. Do you think there is anything to that?
Steve Spurrier told me this a few years ago when I asked him when I thought Nick Saban would retire. He said he's going to keep coaching as long as he's got the best players. He doesn't have all the best players anymore, Brandon.
Yeah.
And that does have something to do with the state of the game. The coaches are no longer in control. The players are. That tyrannical style that led Nick Saban to championships no longer works. It doesn't translate. You saw that, and he was a different guy this year. He turned into everybody's grandfather, and that can only go so far. He's not the same guy, and the game's not the same. So the game changed. Listen, at some point, Greg Maddux lost his control. At some point, Tiger Woods lost his consistency or his power off the tee. Nick Saban lost his fastball. Alabama has not been the best program in the country since 2020. And quite frankly, the only reason they were that year is there were probably some inducements for 5 seniors to stay that probably would have normally gone pro. Alabama was beating people with retention. They weren't beating people with recruiting or coaching. They were beating people because they had 5 seniors that could have been drafted the year before in the first 3 rounds. That was the last great stand for Alabama. Georgia knocked Alabama off the pedestal in 2021. Georgia repeated as national champions in 2022. Alabama landed at last blow. They beat a depleted Georgia team that ran out of gas. The schedule makers didn't help the dogs out. Go back and look at that November schedule and compare it to Alabama's. So Georgia ran out of gas, but then Michigan knocked him out. That wasn't a game where we said that was a fluke. Michigan was better than Alabama. That's why they won that game. Nick Saban no longer has the best program in college football. He has the most resources. He has the most money. He has the most power. He has people catering to him. He has the schedule makers and he still didn't win it all, Brandon. It was time to go. He wasn't going to win another title. That's why Nick Saban's leaving. And he sees that. And the beautiful thing is, here's the thing. He's not dead. He's not going away. You're going to see him on game day. He's still going to control the narrative. We're still going to hear his philosophy. The statue's already been built. He's not going anywhere. He's still going to be making a ton of money. That's why I sat down last night, Brandon. I said to myself, I need to write a really nice. I said, no, I'm not feeling it. I don't. There's no glorifying farewell. I don't need to tell everybody how many titles. He tells you every time. Game day won't let it go. Kirk Herbstreit's dancing on the set when he's winning games. I mean, college football's been a fan of Nick Saban. I don't know how much more we can do to praise this guy. He did a great job. He's won more titles. Great. But he's not the best anymore. And he figured out it was time to go. As simple as that.
Mike, we certainly appreciate your time on the program today. Interesting perspective on what is one of the bigger stories we've seen come down the pipe here in quite some time. So we'll look forward to reading plenty more from you there at DawgNation.com. And, of course, have you back here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp again very soon as well.
Appreciate it, Brandon.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
All right, good stuff there with Mike Griffith. And speaking of good stuff, let's get ready to go cruising now around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Let's get you ready for the DawgNation Cruise coming up in April. I had a fun conversation yesterday as it relates to the DawgNation Cruise, getting everything kind of squared away for that. A lot of folks on board, more folks joining up. It's amazing how much new excitement, new energy there is about the DawgNation Cruise once you turn that calendar to the brand new year. The way it kind of goes is that we start talking about this kind of a year in advance, and there's some early energy, early excitement. Then you kind of get into the sort of the grind of the season, and people are thinking about other things. They're getting ready for the holidays, and it sort of feels like April of 2024 is a long way off. And yet once you turn that calendar to the brand new year, we are obviously in 2024 now. Well, now there's way more renewed excitement in that DawgNation Cruise once again, and we're really seeing that in terms of the stateroom bookings and the folks kind of taking advantage of this last big push to be on board. So Jessica Slater, great travel agent, specially selected for us by Royal Caribbean. They believe that every Royal Caribbean cruise vacation made better when you have a great travel agent to help you plan it. And so Jessica's the one trusted by Royal Caribbean to help us plan our Dog Nation cruise. So you can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com. Ask her all the questions you have. But specifically, you can go to royaldogs.com. That's a website. Obviously, dog spelled the way it's supposed to be, DAWGS, royaldogs.com, to find out more information specifically about our Dog Nation cruise. First time ever on an Oasis-class ship, one of the largest at sea, Allure of the Seas. We're going to Nassau in the Bahamas. We're going to Perfect Day, Coco Cay. We've got more specially themed Dog Nation events than ever before. It's going to be an amazing time. All right, it's also going to be an amazing time thinking about who the next Alabama football coach is going to be. Now, a lot of you know, I've said this plenty of times over the years, I love coaching searches. I love the rumors. I love the, would this so-and-so be a good fit? I just love all of that. I think that's really fun. And obviously, this is one of the most fun conversations we've ever had because Saban is the GOAT, and the next coach at Alabama has got such big shoes to fill. So who might it be? We said a little earlier in the show that, you know, one of the potential candidates, if you want to think about rising stars, not quite yet a head coach, someone like Glenn Schumann. Early chatter has Schumann kind of on the list, but we don't really hear that, you know, taking shape too much as of yet. The names I think you hear more prominently right now, guys like Dan Lanning at Oregon, Steve Sarkisian at Texas, Lane Kiffin obviously at Ole Miss. These are some of the early names that are out there. Now, here's what I'm going to tell you. In the case of Lane Kiffin, what I wonder about is, for a guy who has been as active in the transfer portal this offseason as Kiffin has been, is that some sort of foreshadowing from him that he knows he's not going to be Alabama coach in 2024? Because my guess is the reaction and the sort of interaction that Kirby and Saban had in the clip we played for you to begin our show today, it certainly seems like Kirby could have been aware this was possibly Saban's last season. If Kirby thought that, the other coaches on that kind of text thread with him, they're always, you know, sharing stuff back and forth with each other. Perhaps they could have known as well. It would not be impossible to think that Kiffin knew Saban was going to retire, but when you're getting the Ole Miss, you know, NIL folks to give as much money as they've given and kind of pushing that as hard as you've pushed it, is that a signal that Kiffin knows he's not going to be Alabama coach in 2024? Or does Kiffin just simply not care and he'll get the Ole Miss folks to do whatever and then just leave them high and dry to go to Alabama? Obviously, Kiffin's past suggests that's certainly a possibility. In the case of Steve Sarkisian, you know, prior to this year, I think you would have said for Sarkisian that as a head coach, he's probably below the level of what Alabama would require. This was a guy that, you know, did not have great success at USC, was only okay as a Washington head coach, pushing aside whatever, you know, kind of personal issues that he's been open and discussing and seemingly kind of moving on from. Just the actual results on field were a pretty mixed bag for Sarkisian overall. But that's kind of changed now. You know, Sarkisian did win the Big 12 in Texas' final year in that league. They did make the college football playoff. They played a tough, hard-fought game against Washington the other night. That if Sarkisian was a real candidate for the Alabama job, I would say now he's got the kind of resume that could perhaps get him hired. Not a slam dunk. It's not obvious that he'd be successful, but of all the offensive coordinators, Lane Kiffin included, that Nick Saban brought through his time at Tuscaloosa, I believe the single best was Sarkisian in terms of the impact that he made on the games. Now, the absolute single best hire I believe that Alabama probably could make. In fact, as someone who's a pretty obvious Georgia partisan, the one hire I don't want them to make is Dan Lanning. Now, it's not obvious to me that Lanning would leave Oregon right now because I think that Oregon could perhaps be positioned to be the best program in the Big Ten moving forward. And I say that knowing full well what Michigan and Ohio State have been. I believe that's how well set up for success Oregon might be. There's probably less pressure on Lanning right now at Oregon, and there seems to be a very ready supply of the kind of funds that get you quality transfers and big-time high school recruits, that Lanning's got a pretty good thing in Eugene, Oregon right now. But if you want to be the best, the SEC's the league you want to be in, and perhaps following Nick Saban's the kind of thing you're not afraid to do. I respect Lanning enough to say I hope that Dan Lanning is not the next coach at Alabama. But obviously, if that's what I don't want, then perhaps that's what Alabama should want more than anything else. We'll see if they're able to get that. Beyond that, we're already starting to see some reverberations through all of this. We've already seen Alabama's first decommitment here. It's Ryan Williams from the class of 2024, who's obviously going to make his decision coming up in February. Pretty big deal here to start to see, some of these dominoes, starting to fall of, perhaps big-time recruits just not viewing Alabama the same way with Nick Saban no longer there. I know Mason Short, the offensive line commit to Alabama for the class of 2025, he kind of put out a very cryptic message there as well of, no comments at this time. So a lot of big-time recruits going to be rethinking the situation at Alabama in light of the Nick Saban retirement, which will be open season on those flips, perhaps from Georgia and a lot of these other programs there too. It could get real interesting real fast on the recruiting front. And then there's also the issue with the Alabama roster overall. There's always confusion right now because the rules are so weird in terms of when you can and cannot transfer, but it is widely believed, in fact, I'll show you this, Rivals putting this out, that Alabama players now have 30 days into the transfer portal. In other words, when your head coach leaves, that opens a new portal window for you here, and so Bama players do have an additional 30 days now to transfer. The previous transfer window closed January 2nd, but there was a 5-day grace period. I think it was 5 days after your bowl game beyond that January 2nd deadline. So Bama's clock didn't start until after their game on January 1st. But now it's an additional 30 days for Bama players currently on the roster to transfer. But that's not necessarily what it's all cracked up to be, because transferring requires a couple of things. It's not just the freedom to leave your current school, your current team. It's also the ability to get to a new program. And the biggest issue facing all of that's going to be, if you're a Bama player, you want to play somewhere else, school is essentially starting in other places. And it's been a long time since I've been a college student, but you're going to have to go through like drop ad to get classes, to get accepted into school. And, this is one of those things where, I have to confess that if Nick Saban timed his announcement to make it difficult for Alabama players to transfer out, on the one hand, it sort of seems like the sort of shrewd thing that Nick Saban would do. On the other hand, that's not exactly the coolest thing to do for these players currently on that roster. It's one of those things that, if you're an Alabama player, you're sort of wondering, did you sort of stick it to me on the way out the door here? Saban, a great coach. Sometimes I'm not quite so sure how good of a guy he actually is. And this may be perhaps an example of that. But at least by the letter of the law, there is a transfer period open to these Alabama players if they do want to leave, if they do want to go somewhere else. But they're going to have to work pretty hard to get accepted into a new school and get into classes here as these semesters across the rest of the country are getting ready to get going. So a lot to consider with all of that, and obviously there'll be many more days of discussion on this as this story continues to unfold. But for now, we'll make that cruising around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And before we wrap up today, I alluded to this a little earlier. So it has always been my dream during the DawgNation Daily era, which began in 2015, to have something other than a football team to talk about. Now, listen, our show would always be 99.9% football content-wise because that's what the audience wants, and this is not a hobby. This is a business, and so therefore we're going to serve the needs of the audience. The audience wants to talk about football, so therefore we do it. But we really haven't had a really good non-football story for almost the entire time we've been doing the show. Georgia basketball right now kind of has the look of being that. They won again last night against Arkansas. They've got number 5 Tennessee. I know, recently lost, but number 5 Tennessee coming in on Saturday. I'm going to the game, taking my family to the game. I'm pretty fired up about this Georgia basketball team right now. This is by far and away the best Georgia basketball team that has been in place since we've been doing DawgNation Daily. And so, if you've been knee-deep in college football, we all have, perhaps if you haven't paid attention to Georgia basketball in a good number of years, this team might be worth your attention. Mike White's got them playing a pretty good brand of basketball. Got a big man. This is a fun team right now, worth your time. And we'll never be like basketball show here. We're a football show. But that doesn't mean we can't be rooting for another Georgia team. And right now I'm rooting pretty hard for this Georgia basketball team, who I would say right now, on the looks of how things are going, long winning streak, a couple of games already in hand in the SEC, this is the kind of team that has a shot to make the NCAA tournament, which is a pretty big accomplishment for Georgia teams here right now. And so with that, we'll wrap things up here today. And as you might imagine, a couple of Nick Saban-themed golden shoes here. I'll show you the first one on the screen. Nikki writing in to say, I just want to be the first to say it, BA. He gives the hashtag DawgNation Daily. And I love this. It's the national championship hat. I believe this is from 2021. But he's covered up the year 2021. He's put 2024 on there, so Nicky becomes the first to kind of call his shot, Georgia to win the national championship in 2024. Nick Saban will be watching on television, as he has been for most of the last few national championship games. And Nicky's got Georgia winning that one there. So, Nicky, we'll give you a golden shoe for your opinion. Also, there's this, and this requires a little bit of explanation. So there's all these like T-shirt bot things now that are, trying to get in there and mentions on Twitter and stuff and sell T-shirts. And the image that they've kind of created, I guess, using AI is Nick Saban holding up his hand to his face with all the championship rings. And a lot of, Bama fans have been sharing this picture. Well, Jeff Doak wrote in to say, just to keep things in perspective, tonight about Nick Saban. So you've got all the championship rings, but Jeff's got all the caveats here. 2020 COVID year, 2017, Tyler Simmons was onside. 2015, Kirby was Alabama's defensive coordinator. 2012, 2011, Kirby was Alabama's defensive coordinator. 2009, Kirby was still Alabama's defensive coordinator. So Jeff Doak having some fun, putting some asterisks next to the Alabama National Championships. I find that to be very funny. Jeff will give you a golden shoe there as well. Lousy, stinking Gators. How does the Nick Saban firing, or should say retirement, impact them? Not at all, because they're not relevant enough for it to matter. And it's been 1,160 days since they've beaten Georgia. To give you an idea how bad things have been, and it only gets worse in the future. That is good news. Appreciate you being here. We'll see you tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. And on video. Time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, the one you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised for the price that's promised. And by now, y'all probably know the drill, at least for the little bit of foreseeable future. The show you just saw was pre-recorded, but I am live now and in living color, ready to take your comments, reacting to the Saban stuff, how it affects Georgia. You want to laugh at sad Alabama fans? We can do all of that here over the course of the next couple of minutes. All right, let's see. Devian Arrow says that Kirby's in Alabama now picking up transfer portal players. Yeah, my prediction is a traffic jam on I-20 eastbound. Could be quite a lot of traffic heading that way. People coming out of Tuscaloosa on their way to the east side here. Perhaps that's the case. Frank Patterson also brings up an interesting point that poor Michigan fans are trying to celebrate their national title, and the media is all over Nick Saban and celebrating the career coming to an end. Yeah, a little bit of a spotlight being taken away from them on that. Yeah, kind of hate to see that. Very interesting timing for all of this. I would agree on that. 478 Dog on the subject of Jeremy Pruitt, who obviously is dealing with like a 6-year show cause penalty. And I'm no fan of Pruitt necessarily because I don't think he behaved very distinguished while he was here at Georgia, going back to this time as defensive coordinator. But I also think the idea that he's gotten like the most severe punishment we've seen anybody get in a long time, I think that's frankly kind of ludicrous that Jeremy Pruitt's kind of put up as a scapegoat for a system that's essentially now legal. So I don't think that Pruitt's handling by the NCAA was fair, but I'm also not shedding any tears because I'm not quite so sure I like Jeremy Pruitt. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron says, let's just admit it. Bama's going to get Connor Stallions as the new head coach. They want to replace the guy who pays the refs with the sign stealer. Yeah, there you go. Perhaps moving from one issue to another there on all of that. B. Pethel says that Pruitt was an innovator. Listen, I think Pruitt's a good coach. Now, good head coach, probably not, but a good football coach. And when he came to Georgia's defensive coordinator 2014, I think that Georgia probably needed some of the sharp edge that Pruitt probably had. Could have probably used some more of that. But I think that, Pruitt also, the best that I can tell based on people who, were a little closer to that situation than me at the time, will tell you that I think that Pruitt was disrespectful to Coach Richt, and I can't be on anybody's side who is disrespectful to Mark Richt. Kenneth Holt says, no matter who that next Bama coach is, how much would you bet that the next head coach doesn't make it 3 years? It's obviously not easy following in Nick Saban's footsteps. And it's also worth pointing out that, when Saban came to Alabama, this is one of those things, it's just amazing how narratives change, and obviously we're talking about a good period of time now, 15, 16 years, something like that. But when Saban came to Alabama, it was sort of thought that he wouldn't be at Alabama for a very long time. Like this is one of the things that, going back to my early days of Sports Dog, things like that, this is one of the things I got right. I remember believing, now I didn't predict he's going to be the greatest coach of all time, but I did believe that when Alabama acted aggressively to hire a coach that had won a national championship, I believe the likelihood was he'd also win one at Alabama, or at least have them very competitive. In fact, it was the same line of thinking that had me telling all of you, Texas A&M, aggressive hire, national championship coach Jimbo Fisher, of course that's going to work. So the same logic failed me in terms of Jimbo Fisher, but I got it right in terms of Bama moving in quick to bring in Nick Saban. And one of the things that would sometimes, kind of come up as an issue related to that was that people would say, well, you may get him, but he's not going to be at your job very long, because that is what Saban's history had been. He had, only been at Miami for a couple of years. He'd only been at LSU for a period of years prior to that, short period of years. Michigan State, somewhat short-term tenure. So Nick Saban had the reputation a bit of being a little bit of a job hopper prior to coming to Alabama. So, there was a thought that Saban wasn't going to stay at Alabama very, very long, and obviously ended up making that the destination that he'll be remembered for in his career. So, the idea the next Alabama coach only makes it, 3 years. There was a time when plenty of people, when it came to Alabama, were only thinking 2 and 3 years at a time, because they had a lot of coaches that cycled through pretty quick, and the next guy could, very well be kind of a return to that. Let's see what else. Let's see what else is going on here. Philip Wells coming over here to the YouTube side after being on Facebook, saying, just doing a wellness check for the Gump Man fans over here from Facebook. Yeah, a lot of sad Alabama fans today, and you hate it for them. Listen, there are a lot of Alabama fans who made their entire personality reverence for Nick Saban, and obviously now they got to kind of reinvent themselves here a little bit. Jonathan Aaron says, yesterday was a sad day for the refs. How they're going to make a living losing out on that extra money. Very funny stuff. Pizza Man also says there aren't very many Alabama fans in our comment section here today. You hate that. Now, I do think it's weird when you see the statue of Nick Saban there in Tuscaloosa, and the fact that people are like throwing moon pies. Is that what Saban likes? Moon pies and things like that. It's pretty strange. I mean, he's still alive and well, and just moving into a retirement phase. But the level of sadness around this in Tuscaloosa is a bit odd. But more strange than that are the Auburn fans who are celebrating as if they've actually won something. That's pretty strange. Because the other thing too is like in the case of Auburn, they actually beat Nick Saban some. Gus Malzahn beat him 3 times. So I don't know. Brian Harsin almost beat him, and Hugh Freeze almost beat him this year. So it's not like Auburn, didn't have any success against Saban. And it's not like, listen, Georgia's path to multiple national championships may have gotten a little bit easier with no Nick Saban there, but I'm not quite so sure how much Saban's retirement actually helps Auburn overall. They may be beyond help here at this point. Jay Shipe says Bama's best scenario is grabbing Lane Kiffin as head coach and Brian Hartline as offensive coordinator for recruiting elite wide receivers. Yeah, the future of Brian Hartline could get pretty interesting. This is a guy who's sort of been a Midwestern dude the entire time, and you sort of think his first head coaching job, if it's not at Ohio State, actually may become somewhere in the Big Ten. But that's a pretty interesting name to have in a discussion like this. And obviously Lane Kiffin's name is going to come up. I still wonder, and I think I said this during the regular broadcast, I kind of wonder if you're Kiffin, so aggressive in the transfer portal, are you doing all of that if you've got a shot at the Alabama job, or all of this, is it being done because you're not going to be the Alabama coach next year? Because remember, when the Auburn job came open in 2022, Ole Miss nosedive. I mean, Ole Miss completely fell into the tank. It seemed pretty obvious, I think, just to a neutral observer, that Kiffin was completely distracted by all that, much the same way that Hugh Freeze's final year at Liberty went into the tank once the Auburn job came open. These coaches pursuing these other jobs, that became a huge distraction to them. Well, yesterday, on the heels of the Saban retirement announcement, Ole Miss went out and took another transfer player. They're just not respecting a whole lot of boundaries on that right now. Kiffin is certainly behaving right now as someone who expects to be at Ole Miss, and I would assume that Kiffin probably knew that Saban was going to be stepping down. So context clues would lead me to believe that the next guy is not Lane Kiffin. I know Jake Shipes is a proponent of Lane Kiffin's, and I'm not. This is not like, is he a good fit for the job one way or another? I'm just saying the very newsy offseason that Lane Kiffin's already had looks to me like someone who's planning on being in Oxford again next year. Am I wrong for reading it that way? Kenneth Holt says the only way this could get better for Auburn or Georgia fans if Dan Mullen would be hired as Alabama's next head coach, which is very funny. Very funny. UGA 4 Life Brunetti says it seems to me like a lot of fans retired when Saban retired. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I mean, obviously there are a lot of sort of bandwagon fans who've kind of come on board Alabama over the years. We'll see where they go if Alabama takes that step back. Let me pop over here to some of the other comment sections. I'll come back to YouTube in a moment. On DawgNation.com here, Herb Hamilton says, how about a wild shot maybe at Orgeron? I kind of joked about that yesterday, too. He's out there right now. Monkster also says, Mike Shula's out there sitting by his phone waiting for a call. Yeah, it is not exactly a laundry list of legends, kind of pre-Nick Saban for a good long time there as Alabama coach. Shula's obviously one of those. LA Dog says, is there any real chance that we see a vacated national title for Michigan, given all the allegations? If they really cheated, then it should be considered. Doubt it will. But, yeah, so LA Dog, I think that you're probably right in that I don't believe it'll ever be a real consideration. I don't know if this day and age the NCAA has enough power to take away Michigan's national title. I don't know that they do. And if they did, Michigan is not typically speaking the kind of program they want to take stuff from. The NCAA likes acting a little lower down the food chain than a big, distinguished university like Michigan. That's not usually the kind of fights that the NCAA has picked, even when they did have power. And in this day and age, I'm not really quite so sure how much power they still have as an organization at all anymore. And I do think we have a bit of a comp for what's going on with Michigan. A few years ago, when the Houston Astros were essentially caught red-handed cheating, there was not really much done to them. For the most part, they kind of got away with that. And I believe the reason why they did is the other 29 owners looked at the situation in Houston and said, I don't know that our value as an organization is increased by diminishing the value of an Astros organization that represents a very big city like Houston. If we kind of throw the book at them and render them uncompetitive for a period of years, that devalues the Houston organization, and that's like the fourth biggest city in America. And so therefore, if you devalue the Houston organization, once again, kind of playing the comparable game, does that devalue all the Major League Baseball organizations by proxy? In other words, without getting in, do I want to say this? To me, it's the classic example of sort of like capitalism and corporatism. And I'm going to be very careful how I thread this needle. But, corporatism is when you're the Houston Astros, even when you cheat, you still get away with it because you're too big to fail and there's too much money to be made by just overlooking it, letting you do what you want to do. I think there's a certain version of that with Michigan where, it's like Michigan probably cheated, but if you throw the book at them, it may cost everybody a little bit of money. So therefore you just sort of turn and look the other way and just pretend that it didn't really happen. That sort of feels like what is going on with that. And I'm going to hush up and not say anything else about that because that's about as far as I want to take that. Let's see what else. BMAC says Bama might take a throwaway coach for a couple of years. Maybe so, but I'd also say this, that Bama's coaching search probably didn't start this morning. That while, the image is out there, Nick Saban was just coaching right to the very last moment. The truth is, if you're Greg Byrne, you have been knowing for a while this was going to be kind of your biggest professional moment. Eventually, you'd be hiring a coach, and perhaps he knew that it would be this year. So Alabama, at least theoretically, has got a plan in place. And they may not have an agreement in place, but theoretically anyway, they've got a plan in place here. So, maybe part of their plan is to try to hold this roster together, see what you can get out of it, and then think about a coaching search again beyond that for a very different set of circumstances. That's kind of what Mississippi State did with Zach Arnett. Now, I'm not comparing, Mike Leach tragically passing away to Nick Saban retiring, but I am saying moving past what, caused it to occur, it was fairly obvious that Mississippi State said, we got to have a coach for right now, and we'll rethink this later on. And ultimately, Zach Arnett got 1 year. Is Alabama operating on as much of a short-term proposition here? I'm assuming probably not, because unlike the tragic passing of Mike Leach, Alabama's had a little bit more time to get ready for this. And so I'm guessing they probably have a little bit more of a long-term plan in place. But if you are really shooting for the very top of the list here, if you're shooting for the Lannings or the Sarkisians or perhaps even the Lane Kiffins, there is always some chance you won't be able to get agreement with them. And sometimes, sometimes coaches change their mind. Sometimes coaches get cold feet. So they probably have a structure of a plan in place for how they want to go about this, but they may have something short of total agreement here right now. Brooksy says, in business, you never want to replace a GOAT. Always been compared, never will live up. Same for Saban's replacement. I'd say that's true, but I mean, if you're a young up-and-comer, which Alabama perhaps wants something a little bit more established than that, are you saying there are good reasons to turn down the Alabama job? I think that's probably true, unless you've got leverage with Alabama. We talked a little earlier on our 1st and 15 about the idea when you have a contract, you come to terms. Sometimes the terms are what end up mattering more than the actual money, because once you get to the level of it's more money you can spend in a lifetime, anything on top of that is essentially inconsequential. But what actually matters in the quality of life of a coach is the actual terms of the deal. How much guarantee can you get from NIL Collective, from big-time boosters of this is the money we will give you to operate with? How much freedom do you get from your employer in terms of this is what I want to do? For instance, over the course of years, Saban got told no a couple of times. I think we're led to believe that Saban at one point wanted to hire Hugh Freeze. When Hugh Freeze was kind of persona non grata, was told no. Saban wanted to bring in perhaps so-and-so player sometimes, was sort of told no to that. Do you create the kind of power that doesn't, get you told no about anything? So you don't want to follow the GOAT unless you're so desperate to replace the GOAT that you give a set of contract terms to a coach perhaps more favorable than you would have typically done. I guess that's the other side of that. BMAC says the rumors have it that Lanning is currently in Tuscaloosa. Y'all be really careful here. We're going to be in fake tweet season on top of fake tweet season here. I think that's an unsubstantiated rumor. And the other day, we had the one with Jamie Chadwell where supposedly he was sort of time-stamped in Starkville, Mississippi, and that turned out to be a photoshopped fake tweet. Some people just like to see the world burn here, and there are going to be a bunch of fake tweets out there. So be really, really careful about that. There's going to be a lot of that probably as it relates to some of this Saban stuff. I do not believe that Lanning is in Tuscaloosa right now. Do not believe that's the case. Be on guard for some fake stuff on some of that. Let's see what else. William Camacho says that Robert De Niro could be the next head coach for the Gumps for all I care. So William is in here weighing in with his thought. David West says Dabo says he's going to stay and buy stock in Taters. So there you go. James Hayes says that Greg McElroy's mad that he didn't get to break the news. Yeah, I think it's fairly obvious that the one person who was always going to break the story was going to be Chris Lowe from ESPN. Lowe has essentially acted as a stenographer for not Kirby Smart, for Nick Saban for quite some time. Very close relationship, perhaps too cozy. But nonetheless, it was always going to be Chris Lowe who was breaking the story. Chase Smith also says that it's better to be the guy who replaces the guy who replaces Saban. I would say that's true, but that's certainly conventional wisdom. I guess what I'm saying, though, is that sometimes life is not easy to control. Outcomes are not easy to control. So you may say, oh, I'm going to plan it just perfectly, and I'm going to wait on this Alabama job opening. It's a job that I really want, some coach might say, but I'm going to wait on it and get it the next time that it's open. But the problem is there may not be a next time. I mean, this is probably what Georgia faced as well, with the thought of, Kirby Smart leaving Alabama's defensive coordinator and going and being a head coach and somewhere else, maybe in the SEC. And, a line of thought would be, well, that's okay. We'll let him go do this for now. And then when we're ready for him, when Mark Richt's, tenure comes to an end, well, now we'll be ready to go out and get Kirby Smart and he'll have some head coaching experience. But that's once again assuming that outcomes are perhaps more controllable than they actually are. And so if the Alabama job is your dream job, let's talk about Dan Lanning for a moment. Lanning has worked at Alabama. Lanning has every reason to want to stay at Oregon, and perhaps that's the wisest course of action for him to do. But this notion of, well, I really want to be Alabama coach, but I don't want to be Alabama coach now. I'm going to let a couple of years pass, and then I'll be Alabama coach. If it's really your dream to be Alabama coach, sometimes that job doesn't come back open. If it's the job that you really want, the guy that you allow to take it, maybe he comes in and he uses the resources that are in place and the desperation of the Alabama boosters to have perhaps a seamless transition to a new coach. And maybe he uses that to build that up. And, maybe that sort of guy who follows the guy never ends up being an issue. And maybe we should look and see, are there examples of successful guys who followed the guy? Maybe we should look at that and see. But you do have to be aware of the fact that, trying to time things perfectly, if you ever bought or sold a home, one of the things you sometimes hear is you can't really time the market. There is no perfect time to sell and then a perfect time to buy. The market you buy in is the market you sell in. And same thing for coaching search situations. Well, it'd be more perfect for me to leave my current job 2 years from now, but that job that you really want, if there is one that you do really want, maybe it's not available 2 years from now. So just something to think about. Sarah Williams-Rich says, I thought Saban was near the end. I've never seen him look so stressed. I thought maybe health problems. They say it's his wife's health. I don't know about that, about any kind of like health thing, but there's also something to be said for, and I was joking with our audience a little earlier, I don't believe I'll ever retire. I think I'll always want to coach. Yeah, I'll always want to coach. I think I'll always want to do a show like this in some form or fashion, whatever the technology looks like. I'll always want to do it. But there is something to be said for, having a healthy, happy retirement, living good years, late in life with good health. The best that I can tell, Saban, while he maybe looks a little stressed, college football has obviously gotten more challenging. By appearances, Saban still seems to be a very healthy guy, comes across as pretty energetic. Maybe he just wants to enjoy some of these years in kind of a non-coaching capacity in good health. And if he does, that's obviously a very, very valid life choice. Let's see this. Daniel Aldridge says Michigan made Saban retire. Very funny. Let's see what else. Tony Elliott says that Bama knows who its coach is right now. Maybe it does. Maybe it does. Jennifer Stevenson Fleming says, we want them to take Tommy Rees, like you said yesterday. Oh, my gosh. You talk about something that would make me happy. Tommy Rees is the next Alabama head coach, the current offensive coordinator this past season. Boy, that'd be beautiful. You talk about just taking a team and just scratching them off the list. No worry there. One of these tough road games for Georgia gets a whole lot easier if it's Tommy Rees who's the head coach next year. I believe that's probably true. Wayne Kirkland says Father Time is undefeated. It certainly is. Ken Holcomb says my money says Saban's replacement has accepted the job in terms already. What do you think, BA? Maybe that's the case. I do believe that Alabama has had some runway on this, but if you want the highest level of candidate possible, that may not be a guy you can get an immediate agreement with. In other words, if you want to shoot a little lower down the food chain, having that guy secure and ready to go, maybe that's the case. But if it's truly a guy like a Dan Lanning or something like that, that's a guy who perhaps needs a lot of convincing. Or if it's a Steve Sarkisian, maybe much the same way. That would be a guy that would need a lot of convincing. So maybe they do have agreement in place. I know we're coming up on a open period in recruiting again. So, having something to sell to these recruits when the open period begins this weekend is obviously important. But depending on how you're going up the food chain, you may not be able to do that. I mean, there's probably some thought to if you do know who it is, you still don't announce it immediately because you want to give Saban his new cycle, the Saban reverence, the Saban respect, the Saban retrospective. You want to give that some time. But if Alabama knows who the next coach is, now that we've had a day's worth of, oh my gosh, how great Nick Saban is, they probably don't wait too much longer if they do truly know, because they do have a chance to host recruits here this weekend. And the roster they currently have is going to be, to a certain extent, need to be re-recruited. And then Ryan Penley can on that same topic. So I'm sure Alabama would like to have this done quickly if it possibly can. Caleb Myers pointing out the fact that currently there is no Power 5 active coach that's beaten Kirby Smart since 2018. It's amazing stat. I saw our buddy Ben Wolk have it on Twitter yesterday too. An amazing stat. And, the coaches that have beaten Kirby Smart, I mean, it's not a very long list, especially the Power 5 level right now. I guess Gus Malzahn would have done that in 2017. He's at UCF now. Hugh Freeze would have done that in 2016, obviously at Auburn now. And in terms of active Power 5 coaches, I believe, as Ben pointed out, I believe that's it. And then the list of guys that, have beaten Kirby beyond that, you get into, like, say, Butch Jones, who's at Arkansas State, and some of those names. But it's not a long list of coaches who can say they've beaten Kirby Smart. And as Caleb pointed out, at the Power 5 level since 2018, that list is precisely 0 names long. Mike Mazzell, good to see you checking here today. Mike, I'm glad you're here. Let's see what else. Robert Hosea says, how about James Franklin from Penn State? I don't know where James Franklin's reputation and brand is here right now. The entire time he's been at Penn State, they just don't beat good teams. They get easily handled seemingly by Ohio State and Michigan every single year. I would say that's a tough sell at a place like Alabama. James Franklin, I think, is probably a pretty good coach, but I think you need some big wins to prove that. And it seems like every year Penn State's kind of sporting a fairly impressive ranking, usually a pretty impressive win-loss record, but the actual wins, the actual trophies on the wall that validate that, it seems like sometimes that kind of stuff is few and far between for them. George Herndon pointing out that Saban's only won 1 national championship since Kirby Smart left. Technically speaking, it's probably 2, although if you disregard the pandemic national title, which I think everybody should, then you get back to, as you said, just the 1. Frampton Groom says, I told everyone after Georgia got ripped off in the SEC championship that this was his last SEC game. That's why the SEC gave them that game so he can retire the SEC champion. So there you go. Frampton weighing in on that. Obviously still upset about the non-catch of Isaiah Bond that was allowed to stand by the officials there. Barry Watkins says, I believe the right coach is the Missouri coach, but I really hope they don't. Yeah, I think Eli Drinkwitz is a good coach too. I do. And I do think that Drinkwitz's got a bright future. I think he's set up for a good bit of success at Missouri here right now. And I've jokingly said this before, as Drinkwitz gets a little bit older, that sort of baby face kind of goes away a little bit. The idea that he comes across as a little bit nerdy, I think as he gets a little older, that'll be less true. All old people essentially look the same. Sometimes it's sort of hard to tell. As an older guy, were you the quarterback of the high school team, or were you sort of the class clown? All old people just sort of look the same. So as Drinkwitz gets a little bit older, I believe the sort of nerdy image that he gives off right now will probably go away. And at that point in time, he's just going to be a football coach like anybody else. That's my theory. Let's go back to YouTube for a moment. Tripp says, how about Bobby Petrino? There you go. 478 Dog says, please hire Dabo Swinney. Yeah, it's very interesting to me that at one point in time, Dabo would have been the obvious name. He's an Alabama grad. He's a 2-time national champion. Kind of a deep history there in Tuscaloosa. But at this point in time, I don't believe Alabama fans want him. And, some of that's because of Dabo's reluctance to embrace the current landscape of the sport. Some of that is the fact they're just not winning as much as they once were. But the other thing about Dabo Swinney is Dabo doesn't have expertise. Kirby Smart has expertise. If Glenn Schumann and Will Muschamp and Trey Scott and Dante Williams and Chidera Uzodiribe, if they all got the flu, if they were all unable to come to the game, Kirby Smart's got the coaching chops to coach the defense with no help, right? I mean, he's got the coaching chops to do the actual coaching. And the actual coaching is a very underrated part of being a coach. We make a very big deal about the recruiting and how you present yourself and the image that you project in terms of the face of the program. And all that really matters. But there is also the just unavoidable fact that someone's got to do the actual coaching. And Kirby Smart can do the coaching. With all due respect, Dabo Swinney just cannot. Dabo Swinney is a very good motivator. He's a very good culture guy. I think there's a lot about Dabo that I like. I believe I like Dabo probably more than some of y'all do. But Dabo Swinney is not going to do the actual coaching without some help. And if I was making a hire, that would concern me of this guy is only going to be as good as the other coaches that he hires. Like, that's a tough sell for me when I'm investing so much into you. Kirby Smart will always have a good defense because Kirby Smart is capable of coaching a good defense. The guys that he bring in supplement the coaching expertise that Kirby Smart already has. Dabo Swinney does not have a similar level of expertise, and that's just a fact. Nature Gator says, just imagine what BA would do if Bama hired Kirby Smart. His world would come to an end. Well, A, it would not, because my world is not wrapped up in anybody else. Here's the thing. Kirby Smart, his success doesn't make me successful. It makes me happy, but it doesn't make me successful. My success is determined by my own actions, my own doings. And I obviously root for Georgia to win because it makes me happy. And as a person that talks about Georgia, admittedly, when Georgia wins, it also, makes our show a little bit more of a winner. Clearly, a rising tide has a tendency to lift all ships. But my job, professionally speaking, is to still win even when Georgia loses. And thankfully, this year so far, we've been able to do that through all kinds of other issues. But once again, Kirby Smart's success doesn't make me successful. It makes me happy. But I do think it's also very funny that at one point in time, the Alabama people or the non-Georgia people would have tried to deride Kirby Smart as sort of a less than version of Nick Saban and someone that was always going to exist in Nick Saban's shadow. Now, the idea, well, Kirby Smart could be Alabama's football coach. Now, that's the sort of unimaginable fantasy they'd love to rub in the face of Georgia fans. It's funny how things change. Funny how things change. Let's see what else. Jonathan Aaron says New England's going to have a presser today. Do you think Bill Belichick is gone? Certainly seems like that's the case. And I'm just telling you right now, I don't think Atlanta should want Bill Belichick as its next coach. I fear that it does. Arthur Blank seemingly has always had this sort of enamoring with the New England Patriots organization. The fact that he would take that so far as to be satisfied with crumbs off their table, I find that to be distasteful. Atlanta ought to aspire to more than this. Bill Belichick is clearly a very good coach, but at this stage of the game, what does he still have to offer? Based on the Patriots' performance this season, very little. He's never been, even at the best of Bill Belichick, he's never been a great, what I would call, personnel guy necessarily. The Patriots have had plenty of lousy draft picks. So even his eye for talent, which seemingly wouldn't go away with years, advanced years, that's never been exactly what you loved most about Bill Belichick. I just don't know what you're getting other than giving him a chance to use your job as kind of a cushy pre-retirement farewell tour type situation. And why the Falcons would subject themselves to that as opposed to thinking more about their own long-term future, I'll never know. This would be another sad chapter for an organization that seems to only have sad chapters. A few more. G. Grace says that Dabo's a top 3 head coach in college football. Kirby, Dabo, and Harbaugh. So, and first of all, G. Grace, in all seriousness, listen, I know what this day must mean to you. And I'm not being funny. I'm not being snarky. You've obviously lived through a great period of football here. So I'm sure you've had a lot of fun personally with your Alabama friends reflecting on all of this. But if you want to base this on accomplishments, well, you can't really knock the Dabo Swinney resume. But I mean, if he truly was a top 3 head coach, you would probably want him as the next Alabama coach. And I'm assuming you don't. Maybe you would tell me that you do. But I certainly can't imagine very many Alabama fans right now would be like, yeah, bring on Dabo Swinney and what you've done for Clemson over the course of the last 3 years. You'll do for us. I can't imagine that's an easy sell for Alabama fans right now. And, really anything beyond the last, like, say, 36 months is sort of a tough thing to kind of use as a replicable comp. Like, what Swinney is right now is the guy who didn't make the playoff in 2021 and had more program regression in 2022, was kind of off the radar completely for a good part of 2023. I would say at this point in time, that's a little bit more in keeping with what Dabo Swinney is. And I say that as someone who probably likes Swinney more than some of y'all do. There's a lot about Dabo Swinney that I do like, but I can't tout him currently as a great coach for a lot of the reasons that we've said earlier. Great resume, but great resume, great coach are two very different things. And if Dabo retired tomorrow, does he get remembered as an all-time great? I believe he probably should. I know you say, well, how do you reconcile these two ideas? Dabo has had a great coaching career. No matter how he achieved the success that he achieved, it happened. 2 national championships and a string of playoff berths. That is a substantial resume. But I don't believe that means very much for him going forward. And I think the last 3 years proves that. Philip Meyer says the Georgia hate is real towards Alabama, but I understand. Yeah, I mean, listen, look, college football is a cutthroat game. There is only so much success to go around. And when somebody has it, that means somebody else does it. And so pretty clearly, Georgia worked to get where Alabama was, shoved it to the side, won 2 straight national championships, and essentially overtook Alabama as a program. So, that's just the way the battle goes. Nick Saban was working to kind of get back to that national championship perch. Unfortunately, at the end of his career, just came up a little bit short in being able to do that. But there is a cutthroat nature to this competition for the people who make their livelihood within the sport, but also for the fans who want the bragging rights of saying, my team's on top. That's what makes the SEC what it is, that intensity of, wanting as much success as you can possibly get. Let's see what else. Aaron Dixon says the Falcons should replace Rich McKay. He says with Tom Brady. I don't know about that, but replacing Rich McKay at this stage, I just think some new leadership. McKay is clearly the most important person in the Falcons organization, even more important than Arthur Blank, perhaps, because it's McKay's influence that seemingly moves Blank. And when you've had to trot out another fired coach again, I just think at some point in time, humility ought to take over and, some sort of contrition to say, all right, clearly we've been getting this wrong, and now we're kind of rethinking the entire thing as a way of getting it better. Let me go back over to a couple of other comment sections, and we'll get ready to wrap up after that. Brooksy says Lanning's got a great gig with the Ducks, but it's Oregon, nothing finer than the SEC. And now that they're in the Big Ten, it's too much travel. So I think that the geographic part of this is something, Brooksy, that I do think ought to be considered. That one of the things that ultimately, if I was Dan Lanning, I'd have to think long and hard about, can I succeed in a league when I am so far from the geographic center of the league? It's always going to be hard. Now, the fact that there are now 3 far west teams in the Big Ten makes that maybe a little bit easier, but being so far from the geographic center of the league, which will always be in the Midwest, is that a long-term path for success? I think it's worth considering. The flip side of that, though, is that right now, Oregon is so good at the talent acquisition game, we would believe because of access they seem to have to NIL funds, that maybe that mitigates against that. And, right now, while, Phil Knight is still kind of at the helm here, because when Phil Knight goes away, how much, true tie does Oregon still have to Nike? They're obviously located right there in the same, space together. But, the deep tie that Oregon has to Nike is really more related to Phil Knight as the Nike founder and not so much as Nike, the corporation. I'm not even quite so sure within sort of corporate governance type stuff if Nike can show a ton of favoritism towards Oregon. But Phil Knight personally certainly can as the founder of Nike. And so this may be one of those things of all things being equal, Lanning would love to be in the SEC, perhaps at Alabama in particular. But if you've got Phil Knight saying, this is my legacy, I'm pouring everything I've got right now into my alma mater as a way of making Oregon football as good as I can possibly be, and that's probably not the kind of thing that you would necessarily shrug off if you were in Dan Lang's position. I'm just sort of thinking out loud here. I'm just sort of, just sort of throwing stuff out there. But there you go. Dave Snow, is this right? A.J. Harris to Penn State. Is that a report that's out there? If so, pretty interesting pickup for the Nittany Lions, who've been pretty aggressive in the transfer portal. They got Julian Fleming from Ohio State. If this report is what I'm seeing is real, now getting A.J. Harris as well. And it's worth, noting that we never really never really got much else on A.J. Harris around the Julian Humphrey stuff, or the same one we got with Daniel Harris. That never really materialized with A.J. Harris. It seemed like he entered the portal with the idea of leaving. Let me see. Yeah, I don't see that right now, but it may be real. I'm not saying that Dave would make it up. I'm saying, but there you go. Yeah. So, by the way, this weekend, when it comes to Athens, the number of big men, both sides of the ball, Juan Gaston, Cortez Smith, Elijah Griffith, what a weekend. And, we talked earlier about the Georgia-Tennessee basketball game. Going to have a lot of those recruits probably coming into the building there for that. Athens is going to be on and popping on Saturday, and I'm happy to be there. Thank you, B-Mac. Yeah, it looks like 24/7's got that. So, A.J. Harris apparently on his way to Penn State. So there you go. Back on Facebook, and we're going to get ready to wrap it up for today. Joseph Kennedy says Billy English for head coach of Alabama. I guess I'm sort of losing my edge here because I'm not sure who that is. Miriam Corbin says Saban's already got a job at ESPN. She has no doubt. The truth is, Miriam and others, I think that Saban could be pretty good on television. And listen, I don't love throwing Saban any extra bouquets. People have done that enough for him, even in his retirement. There's no shortage of that, as you would expect. But I do think that Saban probably has a better personality than sometimes he projects. And I think he could be pretty funny on TV. Or not funny. Funny is maybe the wrong word. Engaging is maybe the better overall word there. I think he could be good. And as a replacement for Lee Corso, or sort of a reimagining of the show, if the Pat McAfee stuff's not going to work out. So strange what's going on with McAfee. I don't care about McAfee's show regular, wise. That's not really, something I'm not for it or against it, but he's never been a good fit for me on game day necessarily. And you kind of wonder as the Aaron Rodgers stuff is playing out, and I am not getting into that, but as some of that kind of stuff is playing out, you're kind of left to wonder, how long can this relationship between McAfee and ESPN really last? And, if that's on thin ice, what does that mean for game day moving forward? I think that Saban could breathe some new life into a show that could probably use it. And listen, I don't have any doubt that McAfee's a very entertaining guy. He's obviously a media sensation. I mean, you can't dispute those facts at all. But even the stuff that's kind of gone viral from him on game day this year, I just don't know that's what I want game day to be. Now, I'm also 40, and, maybe younger people feel differently, and I'm sure they want to attract a younger audience. But, can we treat anything as sacred? I don't know. Thomas Babcock says, can see Saban retiring off the coast of Florida. Yeah, he bought a very expensive home and probably the most expensive real estate, zip code, maybe in American, Jupiter, Florida. That's down there where Tiger Woods and a lot of those guys have lived. I mean, it is mega watt pricey real estate, and his house is very much in keeping with all of that. So clearly the big investment in some very big and nice real estate, that is what he has done. That is what he has done. All right, we're going to get ready to wrap it up for today. Good comments here. Really appreciate that. Y'all make sure you check out RS Andrews online at rsandrews.com for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. That heating means the most right now. I've been telling you about this. It is about to be frigid cold next week. So you want to be ready to go, toasty and warm for all of that. Get your heating system tuned back up to factory fresh specs from our friends at RS Andrews. You can find them online at rsandrews.com, and getting that system that somebody may have told you needs to be replaced. Our friends at RS Andrews are going to be able to tell you how you can get new life out of that old unit. So find them online at rsandrews.com, and they'll do that for you, and it may only cost you $99. All right, we're going to take a break. Be back tomorrow. Dog Nation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp. We will look forward to talking to you then.